When you look at horror games, the true influential classic horror games, it's easy to see why they're so renowned for their time. Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, and Doom, to name a few. Their developers were pioneers in a somewhat unrealized genre for a relatively new industry. Contrary to most people's beliefs, horror in gaming was, and still sort of is, relatively niche. One series, however, that most every horror fan has heard of, that certainly cemented its footprint in the industry, is Silent Hill. It can be argued that Silent Hill was revolutionary for its time, as it was not your conventional horror game. While Resident Evil was more about zombies and jump scares, and Doom was about action and space horror, Silent Hill was more subtle with its horror. A quiet horror. It filled you with a sense of dread from the start, with the heavy fog, the eerie music, and the deep isolation you feel in what seems like an abandoned town. This heavy use of psychological horror had never been done to that effect in games before, and became a staple of the series, for the most part. But that was 20 years ago. Now we have Amnesia, Outlast, and Layers of Fear that adopted the properties of what makes Silent Hill so great. Rumors have been surfacing for the past year of at least one new Silent Hill project in the works. But in what seems like an already saturated market, it begs the question, is Silent Hill still necessary? It's not as simple an answer as it may seem. Funnily enough, while it was a beloved franchise in the early 2000s, the series seems to have become a bit of an urban legend nowadays. You hear stories of how players became afraid of the dark again, how Silent Hill 2 helped change the video game narrative, and how, sadly, it's a series that got crushed under its own weight. But that's a story for a different video. As I mentioned earlier, the appeal of Silent Hill is that it seemed to create a new breed of horror gaming, a more psychological one that emphasized heavily on atmosphere and mood. Sure, there's some gore and a jump scare here and there, but true horror likes to mix things up a bit. The tragedy of what was PT is a great testament to that concept, but I'm jumping ahead. It's clear to anyone who has played the majority of the games in the series that there is an evolution to Silent Hill's horror. To really get a great sense of the types of horror the Silent Hill series incorporates, we're going to have to do brief case studies on all the games. I will be doing in-depth analyses of the games in upcoming videos. The first game, while crude-looking nowadays, was considered by most to be one of the most frightening experiences they'd ever had, myself included. Created by Team Silent, the game adopted a more in-your-face mentality with decaying scenery, creepy music, and the frightening creatures and their terrifying sounds. Okay, it may not seem that scary now, but again, 20 years ago, this was completely jarring. The game also relied heavily on quiet horror as well. Forgetting about the monsters for a minute, Silent Hill really succeeded in building its own world. Much like the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil, the town of Silent Hill is its own character. The dense fog, the low lighting, the environment changing all around you. Yeah, the graphics are dated, but the immersion factor is strong. Doors you just went through are now locked or lead you somewhere completely different. The radio that warns you of impending danger goes off, but in some areas, there's nothing there. You seem to be the only one hearing sirens go off, and when you wake up, you're somewhere completely different. You feel helpless and lost, like the child you're trying to find. It's this kind of thing that I'm talking about. This was unique to gamers at the time, and really made an impression. While the story is somewhat integral to the horror theme itself, I won't be talking about it here. I'm going to save that for another video. The main point I want to get across is the horror in Silent Hill is what truly made it a success. But where do you go from here? Silent Hill 2 was somewhat of a drastic departure from the first game, especially in terms of story elements. It had nothing to do with the first game at all. It was a surprising change, as the whole point and purpose of the first game is in no way referenced or even considered in its sequel. In fact, the story is all about the characters themselves, making the horror very personal, struggling with inner demons. In a huge way, this was a great move. Without having the constraints of the first game, the story, and really the horror too, were free to explore new territory. While the first game was much more apparent with its horror, Silent Hill 2 does a complete 180 and is incredibly subtle. So much so that there are actually very few scary points in the game, but the whole experience leaves you tense. With the graphical upgrade, the dense fog looks even more intimidating and foreboding. The different locations you travel through are all very unique and feel that way. The apartments feel lived in, the hospital looks run down, and the hotel looks like it's been closed for the winter. It all makes you wonder, where the hell is everyone? Even the people you meet seem to be off in their own crazy world. What's more is that it leaves you unsure of a lot of things, including the reality of what you're seeing. But again, it's incredibly subtle. To give an example, for me personally, while I mentioned in the first game I felt helpless and lost, I don't know why, but in the sequel, I always got the feeling like I was being watched. This uneasy feeling never left me, whether I was out in the open or in enclosed areas. And no, this doesn't count. Yeah, Pyramid Head is scary, Maria's creepy, and Eddie is out of his fucking mind. But the feeling of constant paranoia is what kept me on the edge of my seat. This deep sense of psychological horror is what sets it apart from a lot of other games. Many consider this game a masterpiece, not only for the story, but because of the horror. It doesn't insult you by throwing in jump scares left and right, or being overtly gory, or even being heavy-handed with its story. It sets up the scene with something not quite right, something a little out of place, and lets it play out, leaving you to your own devices. Silent Hill 2 really set a new standard yet again with a genre-defining horror. And again, where do you go from here? Silent Hill 3 is arguably when the series peaked. Picking up 17 years after the original, it inserts itself back into the main canon storyline. It also brings the series back to its roots with its more overt horror themes, and dials them to 11. As with the first two games, Silent Hill 3 tries new ways to redefine the horror tropes. You'll start hearing noises, but never find out where it originated. You'll see monsters you can't fully comprehend, and you'll find yourself in surroundings that will scare the shit out of you. The brilliance of this game is that it turns pretty much all gameplay aspects you learned from the first two games completely on their heads. The darkness is so thick that even the flashlight you get early on is fairly useless in some areas, especially in the higher difficulties. In fact, you'll notice early on that there's something missing from this game. Something that was a huge characteristic and defining factor from the first two: the fog. The fog is completely absent from the first 2/3 of the game, and that's because most of this game does not actually take place in Silent Hill. Not that you'd really notice, as most of the beginning areas are in tight spaces. And that's another thing. Combat is much harder in this game, as you will often encounter enemies that have a lot of health and will easily swarm you. So running is usually the best option. One aspect I've purposely not talked about in any of the games so far is the sound design, and that is because they are all very, very good. But Silent Hill 3 easily wins that prize. The noises that emanate from some of these monsters are so terrifying, it's enough to make me jump, no joke. That, paired with some of the most horrifying monster designs I've ever seen, this game is pure nightmare fuel. Silent Hill 3 was yet another huge success for the franchise. So far, the series had ventured deep in experimental waters regarding its methods of horror, but they all managed to create an atmosphere of dread that stayed with you throughout each game. While the method of horror was different for each game, you could still get that sense that it was a Silent Hill game through and through in the way it presented its horror. The ambience and sense of immersion in the games are so thick and palpable, you could actually feel like you were there, wading through the fog and darkness with dozens of abominations hunting you down. Team Silent wanted to keep that steam going, and kept experimenting for their final game. Silent Hill 4: The Room is the biggest departure from the series so far, all in terms of story, gameplay, and horror. In fact, in my opinion, the horror is so unlike anything we've seen in the series so far, it both makes and breaks the game. The monster designs are not that inspired and scary, save for a few, and the sound design is clearly weaker than Silent Hill 3. The main character, in a surprising show of negligence, has absolutely nothing to do with the story itself. He's just some random guy with no real reason to be there, and has zero character to boot. While this may seem a weird thing to comment on when talking about horror, let me explain. There's something to be said about being thrown into a scary situation, not knowing what the fuck is going on, and having to deal with it. However, having no stakes in any situation automatically makes it not scary. Henry was basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. Fine. But his non-reactions to any situation is just incredible. The guy has the emotional range of a lemon. The fact that he doesn't seem to give a single shit to anything that happens to him or anyone else, then why would I, as a spectator, care? If the guy I'm controlling has no regard for his life, then why should I? It's not just him either. It seems the fates were kind to Henry, as his next-door neighbor Eileen is his equal when it comes to emotional resonance. I don't know what the audio director was thinking, if there was one. Oh, and that reminds me, the monster sounds? Talk about removing all tension from the room. It really seems like the game was about to ship, and some disgruntled employee came in and just fucked up the audio. The room does have its scary moments, though. The first 5 minutes of the game are definitely some of the scariest shit I've ever witnessed. The ghosts and hauntings also manage to make my hair stand on end at times. Some of the locations are also in fact very creepy, such as the apartment building and the prison. While any atmosphere it builds is completely broken by its gameplay, which I will talk about in a video essay about this game, it does bring some good ideas to the table, but not everything works. And it's such a shame. There's a lot to like here, but that's the gamble you take when trying something new. And this is why, to a lot of fans, Silent Hill 4 marked the beginning of the decline of the series as a whole. For those that don't know, the series infamously took a wrong turn and started plummeting down a deep, dark rabbit hole. At this point, Team Silent had disbanded, and every game made after The Room was made by different developers. While the different horror themes are still there, the allegories in their presentations in all the games going forward are paper thin at best. Silent Hill Origins is the first tragedy. It's set as a precursor to the first game, even though it still kind of breaks the story a bit. There's not much to talk about in terms of the horror elements. It tries to be an amalgamation of both the first two games, but it fails on a lot of levels. First off, you actually control switching between the fog world and the other world, which really limits the scare factor there. The more control you give a player over the world mechanics, the less scary it actually becomes. Second, it's worth mentioning that by this time, Pyramid Head had become so popular amongst horror fans, the developers wanted to cash in as much nostalgia and fan service as they could with the rest of the games. Origins had the Butcher, which is this game's cheap knockoff version of Pyramid Head. He even looks like Pyramid Head, it's just shameful. God forbid they actually put any effort into creating a new, memorable monster. Like Pyramid Head with James, the Butcher is supposed to be a representation of Travis's inner struggles, in this case his rage, but they make weak justifications for this. It's worth noting that the game itself isn't terrible, it just doesn't have much atmosphere or mood to it. It just kind of is. This is probably due to the fact that it was made for the PSP, so it may have been considered more of a side project than anything else, but Origins is a sorry excuse of a Silent Hill game. Silent Hill Homecoming is an interesting entry, but not in a good way. There are so many things wrong with this game, I don't even know where to begin. You see, the movie came out prior to this game, and Homecoming took the story changes from the movie and built a new canon around it, which I didn't like to begin with. The horror tropes are pretty much all different now. Instead of crazy monsters in Silent Hill, Shepherd's Glen, there's actually people walking around, oblivious to the fact that there are monsters. Additionally, there are cult members who know that there are monsters and are trying to bring about the apocalypse. And I know, there were cult members in the original games, but it's just so stupid here. Trust me, we will get into it in the case study. Beyond that, the horror in this game is just so generic. There's no tension, there's no fear, there's no atmosphere to this game. Nothing tangible or palpable that gets my heart pumping, or makes it skip a beat. On top of that, there's emphasis put on combat in this game. Oh yeah, Alex, the main protagonist, is actually a soldier. Sort of. Regardless, why is there a combat-oriented character in a Silent Hill game? Alright, back to the horror. The transitions to the other world are taken directly from the movie, which did it better. But again, the settings are just way too generic and has no purpose of being there other than it's scary. Also, why is he here? Why the fuck is he here? Did he take a wrong turn somewhere? Total fucking bullshit fan service. It's not scary. This game's not scary. Next. Silent Hill Shattered Memories is another interesting game, but in a good way. This marked the first time a Silent Hill game would make an appearance on a Nintendo platform, and on the Wii no less. Meant to be a reimagining of the first game, huge emphasis on reimagining, it takes a lot of liberties and is not your typical Silent Hill game in any fashion. First off, there's no combat whatsoever. Much like Outlast, you explore and hide, and that's it. At first glance, that may seem really stupid, but it is effective for the most part. For For the majority of the game, you explore the winter wonderland that is Silent Hill, looking for your daughter. Apart from the few characters you encounter throughout the game, it is incredibly devoid of life. When hell literally freezes over, that's when the creatures start chasing you through the maze-like areas, and boy, you better run. Again, this sounds boring, but there is actually quite a bit of atmosphere in the game. While you know that in the normal areas you're perfectly safe, there's a sense of mystery as to what is going on. I can't quite put my finger on why, but the complete stillness of the town around you, other than the wind and snow, is just so chilling, pun intended. It's like you're in a ghost town, looking for your daughter, and there's zero sign of any life. Your phone also acts as your radio, but instead of monsters, you find ghosts of people that prompt text messages, voicemail, and pictures to show up on your phone. There really isn't much more to the horror aspect than this, other than the chase sequences. But again, there is a sense of mystery tied to the story that I'm not going to get into right now. Shattered Memories is pretty well liked amongst the community, although it's probably the least played game. At this point in time, the Silent Hill franchise was really slowing down. There was also a real shortage of horror games with actual horror in them. Games like Resident Evil Revelations, Shadows of the Damned, and Aliens Colonial Marines were all highly anticipated and were right around the corner. Silent Hill Downpour managed to sneak in between those releases, and did not stand out in the least. While not largely popular amongst the fans, a lot of people do acknowledge there is some good stuff in here. Interesting story, crazy transitions, and weird-looking monsters. There's a thread of something good here. But unfortunately, it doesn't get too much deeper than that. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say may conflict with my gripes with Homecoming, but this game does all of it better. The story, again, moves away from the main canon, and I think incorporates more of the universe from the comics. Yeah, for those who didn't know, there's a whole series of comics. They're hard to understand and follow, but the few I read are not too bad. I've definitely read worse. Anyway, there are regular people walking around, somewhat oblivious to monsters lurking in the shadows. But they're also a little weird in their own right. For lack of a better term, it really seems like this version of Silent Hill is actually limbo. There's a lot of nonsensical architecture, weird building and street layouts. It's just bizarre. There's no fog in this game again, but it is replaced by a new mechanic, rain, hence the title Downpour. Now, the rain is actually intrinsic to the plot, so I won't be talking about it here, but what it does mechanically is actually spawn more monsters, and they must really hate the rain because they get way more aggressive. It's actually not a bad idea, but again, they don't really go anywhere else with it. There is also another Pyramid Head clone, but at least this time it makes sense of the story. Somewhat. He can be pretty menacing, and the somewhat twist near the end makes it all the more effective. The horror aspect in this game is very touch and go, but for me, when it hits hard. There are some very effective areas that, while they didn't scare me, they did make me go, what the fuck? Really cool stuff, but again, unfortunately, few and far between. Downpour did borrow the chase sequences from Shattered Memories, as this void chases you when you get thrown into the other world, nightmare world, the other side. I don't even know these fucking names changes throughout the series anymore. The not normal reality world of this game. The first time or two, it can be a little tense, but it overstays its welcome way too quickly. Where the game shines the most, I think, is actually in its side missions. Yeah, this game has side quests. It takes advantage of the open world and fills in some really interesting stories, some of which are actually fairly chilling, like this one. I also like this one. Look familiar? The locations are really nothing to write home about, but again, there are certain sections that are really cool, and some of the otherworld transitions are just so inspired and striking. You could tell there was some love put into this game. I honestly don't know why a lot of people shunned Downpour. It got worse scores than Homecoming, which just blows my mind. Regardless, Downpour was sadly the swan song of the Silent Hill franchise, as the series went dormant shortly after. There is one last thing to talk about, however, and no, it's not this. I'm not even going to acknowledge that piece of shit whatsoever. It's a game, if you can call it that I've not yet touched on. A game that not a lot of people have played, is not easily accessible, yet is highly sought after. I am, of course, talking about the Silent Hill play novel. Following the exploits of the first game, it delves deeper into the story than... Nah, just kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, the infamous PT.
Don't touch that dial now, we're just getting started.
While it can't really be called a game, PT took the world by storm. This playable teaser was tense, it was atmospheric, it was downright terrifying, and we fucking loved it. Once people started to realize it was a new Silent Hill game, it gave everyone hope that the franchise was still alive and actually being cared for. This was not only the brainchild of Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro, but apparently a lot of monster designs and story elements were consulted by the twisted Junji Ito of Uzumaki fame. This was going to be the horror game that defined a generation. At least we hoped. Then, life happened. As it does. Regarding the horror aspect, I mean, do I really have to say anything? From the second you start, you're already uneasy. You wake up in a dark room. There's no one around. No music. Rain pouring outside. And a scary story being told on the radio.
Before the murders, neighbors say they heard the father repeating a sequence of numbers in a loud voice. They said it was like he was chanting some strange spell.
And you keep going down and right, and down and right, and down and right, until you come face to face with the girl from the story on the radio. While Kojima confirmed that this teaser had nothing to do with the actual game and was basically more concept than content, we can only judge its merits based on this teaser, and holy shit, if this is what they put in the demo, I can only imagine what they left out for the actual game. The beauty of PT is that everything I talked about in the previous games, all the different concepts of horror, psychological, quiet, overt, gore, supernatural, it's like Kojima and team took all those aspects, put them in a blender, hit puree for just the right amount of time, and garnished the results. For most people, myself included, this demo was masterful on so many levels, not the least of which technical, but the story it gave was gripping and interesting, the atmosphere was extremely tense and immersive, and the puzzles, while incredibly hard to solve, were very subtle yet engaging. I have a lot more to say, but I will save it for the case study. Regardless, PT set very new standards in an industry where games were being churned out annually like clockwork, and ideas were becoming stale. Suffice it to say, it's a fucking travesty that the falling out happened, and we will never know what could have been. Unless Kojima's rumored new horror game takes elements from this game, but who the fuck knows. Just as the original Silent Hill games inspired a lot of new entries to the horror genre, PT clones were inevitable, and most were pretty good. Visage, Home Sweet Home, and The Beast Inside, they all owe a lot to PT. So I asked my original question again. Is Silent Hill still necessary? It's certainly not an easy question to answer, as the franchise had a lot of missteps, and with the exception of PT, the series hasn't had a lot to offer in a long time. It seems as though the early games paved the way to a new wave of horror games, entries to the genre that surpass the originals in a lot of ways. Not until PT came along did the series bring something fresh, but much like the Five Nights at Freddy's craze, it's been arguably oversaturated. It's undeniable that Silent Hill still means something to the industry. As I said early in the video, it's an urban legend of a franchise where just saying Silent Hill immediately brings to mind images of foggy streets, desolate and decayed buildings, and creepy and deranged monsters. I've read interviews of developers in the industry that one of the main reasons they got into game development in the first place was because of Silent Hill. They wanted to bring something new to the industry, their own flair and creations. The inspiration Silent Hill creates helped bring us games like Alan Wake, Dead Space, and The Evil Within. The release of PT reinvigorated the horror genre in a great way and made horror mean something again. Heavy atmosphere, dark ambience, and deep terror has made a comeback in the previous years, and it is a great time to capitalize on it. Silent Hill is still necessary, and we need to take the series back to its roots. With news being promised to be on the way of a new entry to the series, we can only pray that it is treated with the care it deserves and is a worthy successor to the franchise. The fans are all here, waiting for you.